CHOP, or the Capitol Hill Organized Protest, formerly known as the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, has been removed by Mayor Jenny Durkan's order for the Seattle Police Department to go in and start removing the barriers and tents that were left in this autonomous zone, as well as arrest more than 30 people. And we're going to talk about why that is on today's catching up episode of the Tonic Accord. Hello everyone, I'm Drew Nepley. Today we're going to be talking about CHOP, as I mentioned in the intro. So first off, just a little background. In Seattle at least, part of this George Floyd protest, after the initial kind of violent clashes with tear gas and, really contentious clashes between police and protesters, something arose that was this originally called the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which was, multiple blocks of the Capitol Hill area where protesters basically put up barriers and kind of declared it, a police-free zone. The mayor and the police department kind of let it happen for a few weeks. But we're going to talk about why it kind of turned sour and turned south and ultimately, in my opinion, failed as an effective way to protest, because what happened was they weren't letting in police departments, but then pretty quickly they also decided to not let in other emergency services, and what's happened is there's been shootings and a few deaths, unfortunately. And people were not letting in the police to kind of deal with these things. So over the past 9 days, this is, referencing an article that was written yesterday, July 2nd. Over the past 9 days, the area saw 4 shootings, 2 deaths, arson, and several alleged sexual assaults. So obviously, this autonomous zone may have started peacefully, has certainly not remained that way. A lot of local people said, even people that were against, maybe less trustful of the police, say, we may not feel fully comfortable with the police and their actions in the Seattle Police Department, but we're also very not comfortable with sexual assaults happening and shootings. And I think that this experiment, I think because of that, it's ultimately a failure, right? You can't claim to have this autonomous zone where people can feel safe from something, and then people end up getting. I mean, 2 people have been killed, arson, shootings, and then you're not letting the police come in and investigate the shootings. It's very disturbing, and I want to talk about a little bit about what other examples of this kind of resistance, and I think one of the main ones that a lot of people think this is similar to is the Occupy Wall Street movement, where people after the financial crisis felt that Wall Street was responsible for a lot of the economic downfall, and so people tried to physically occupy spaces in Wall Street and like other financial centers in other cities. But the same thing kind of happened was, the initial movement was probably, more peaceful, more like had more direction, right? More people initially had an idea of why they were there. But over time, people have other things. They have to get back to their lives. They stop being part of the movement, and what's left are the people that I think try and take advantage of these situations. So the Occupy Wall Street movement had a lot of reports of sexual assaults, and a decade ago, and I think we saw the same thing with CHOP. I watched a few videos of people walking through the CHOP area. And again, I haven't been on the ground, so I'm not saying this from a first person's perspective. This was through the lens of an edited video on YouTube, but it did not look to me, and this is the recent part, like within the last week, it did not look to me like any kind of effective way to protest. It looked like a lot of, people tented out. In the video, there was people just using drugs publicly, like heroin use and stuff. a lot of vandalism on the local businesses, and that's also resulted in businesses in the CHOP area. They are now suing Seattle. They are alleging public safety dangers and property damage, and no response from the authorities. It's a tough situation, but I certainly feel for those people that, they didn't ask to be a part of the CHOP area. They were just a local business, and now they were completely shut off from customers and from the authorities for 2-3 weeks, and they feel Seattle's at fault. So this is a so I want to talk about, one local woman was quoted saying the community center block party vibe ended after the first week. This reminds me of the end of the New York City Occupy Wall Street movement almost to a T, she says, except here people are getting killed. So, this is almost, a worse result than the Occupy Wall Street. And again, things with good intentions can go awry. I think Occupy Wall Street on one end, it was a right to bring attention to, the responsibility of some of these financial firms in their inappropriate and risky lending for the financial crisis. Similar to this is, I do think that there's an issue with police departments in America, like especially ones in large cities. And just so you know, the Seattle Police Department has been under federal oversight since 2011 due to some racially motivated incidences that the current mayor was the one investigating. So the Seattle Police Department has a history, and I understand why people might be apprehensive to their control. But this certainly, the CHOP experiment was certainly I think a poor way to go about it, and has led to, again, deaths, sexual assaults, arson, and frankly, it's a pretty widely spread example of a failure. And I do want to be clear that this does not, I don't think this should represent all the entire, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests as a movement. It's hard to put these movements, all together, because there's not necessarily a few like leaders of these protests. There are demands that are and the objectives are becoming more clear. We've talked about some of those objectives on other episodes, but certainly this CHOP thing turned south real quick, and a lot of people in the area also said that it became less about Black Lives Matter. And became more about just anarchy, just having no system, completely dismantling the establishment. And I am by no means an anarchist, and I can see, this is an example of why I'm not an anarchist. These tenths and the drug use and the violence that happened in this autonomous zone, it's really sad. It's a tragedy. And it's because people weren't allowing the correct authorities into that area. So CHOP is basically a failed experiment. I'm interested to see what happens with this lawsuit with the businesses, because I think there's a legitimate case, right? If you say, look, I had a legitimate business in a legitimate spot, and it was destroyed because the police just gave up on a few blocks. I remember when this CHOP thing started, or at the time it was called Chaz. I remember when it started, and I figured it would be a few days, right? It would be, basically just like an extended protest where, hey, we chose Capitol Hill to get the attention of the mayor, to get the attention of the police department, to say our message. But after a few days, it devolved into what it ended up being, and it's just a shame. And the message is then lost. And I think obviously a lot of people suffered, but it's just a weird thing. And I think that if occupying space like that is going to be a successful form of protest, it has to have a concrete message and demands, and maybe perhaps we want to see something by a certain time, and then we can move out. There have been other Occupy style protests on the left and the right. I'm thinking of, just off the top of my head, there was the Native Americans in I believe it was the 70s at the site of the Wounded Knee Memorial to bring attention to Native American issues. There was the I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but the cattle ranchers that were arguing against state and federal land laws and against their private property cattle ranching area. And those men were eventually arrested, but then acquitted. And then I'm not just, I'm not making a statement on either of these protests in their own messaging, but just as like examples that, we do see people occupying space, government space, like those cattle ranchers, I think, occupied a post office. And so we do see this prop up from time to time. And I think most of the time it doesn't end well. And CHOP is now on that list of a form of occupying space protest that just went on maybe too long, or they didn't let in enough authorities to handle the issues of arson and murder, and it led to violence and ultimately, I think, a failed message. So of course it's a tragedy of the two deaths that we've seen recently, and my heart goes out to those that know them and their loved ones. Just a quick message to all the people out there: just stay safe, stay respectful this 4th of July. Keep in mind that COVID is still a thing. But yeah, well, let me know your thoughts on this episode of the Catching Up on the Tonic Accord. The failed experiment that was CHOP in Seattle is now over. The barriers have been removed, and that area of Seattle should go back to normal. So, especially if you are in that area from Seattle, I would love to hear your thoughts and your experiences with this, and whether I just love to hear your thoughts if you are from that Seattle area. Thanks again for tuning into the Tonic Accord, and we have full-length episodes coming up next week, as always, and we'll talk to you then.